Welcome to SSPI's new podcast series, She Reaches Women in Space, where we'll sit down with trailblazing women across the space industry, from founders and engineers to visionaries and scientists, who are redefining what it means to reach for the stars. This is Tanveer Pujara, journalist and podcast host at SSPI-WISE. SSPI-WISE is a global initiative of space and satellite professionals aiming to elevate those who identify as women within the industry. Begun in December 2020, SSPI-WISE has held numerous networking events and workshops, created mentorship and visibility opportunities through mentoring and social media working groups, and generally giving voice to the aspiration of women, space and satellite professionals around the world. Our She Reaches series will explore the spark that launched the careers of some of the industry's star women, the struggles that shape them, and the support systems that sustain them. Today's guest is Vanessa Clark, CEO at Atomos Space, a venture-backed startup focused on building the future of space mobility and logistics. In her own words, she is a physicist turned aerospace engineer and program manager, and now entrepreneur working to build the future of space infrastructure. Welcome, Vanessa. It's a real pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for the kind invitation. I'm excited to be here.
How are you doing? I've heard it's a very exciting time for you at the moment, and some very exciting news to share with us.
Yeah, so we're really excited. So at Atomos, we're constantly getting feedback that we should expand into different markets, so defense and space domain awareness. And this combination with Catalyst does just that. Although with any combination of two mature companies with different products and philosophies and cultures, we're currently working through how to combine them in the optimal way that uses the best of both companies. So fortunately, I like a challenge and I'm really enjoying working through this with the new team.
Fantastic. And congratulations on your new role as well.
Thank you.
So I just want to take it a little bit backwards in terms of your career growth up until this point. Can you talk us through your background? I know that you've studied all over the world. I mean, Australia, Germany, the US. What's been your career path along the way?
Yeah, so I left high school and went to university to study the topics that I thought sounded most difficult, because the thing that I really loved doing and I've enjoyed my entire life is proving people wrong. And so, being a young girl from rural Australia going and studying physics and mathematics at a large university was first appealing. And then, so I set that as a challenge for myself. I pivoted into engineering after working as a physicist for 2 weeks. I realized that I hated statistical analysis. I hated repetitive experiments. And I found that I was leaving my bay and going and talking to the facility designers and operators at the research facility that I was at, because I didn't care about the experiments or the outcomes. I really cared about why we'd designed this building the way we had. So for context, I was working at ANSTO at Lucas Heights, which is it's an incredible nuclear research facility in Australia. So I went back to school. So I made the change after already graduating and starting on a new career trajectory. I went back to school and became an aerospace engineer. Now, this also wasn't without its challenges, because at the time, so in the late 2000s, Australia really didn't have a space industry. And so when I went into my graduate degree in aerospace, it was with the understanding that I would have to leave Australia to work in that field. And fortunately, I landed in Germany. So Germany at the time had a really great immigration policy. If you had a STEM background, if you had a job offer, you immediately got a residency permit, just because they had such a shortfall of talent in key areas. So I landed at a rocket manufacturer at the time called Astrium, now Arianespace. And I was tasked to help optimize the next generation of launch vehicles they were developing. So I actually worked on what turned out to be the Ariane 6 rocket that first flew several months ago. From there, I moved to the German Space Agency. So I had my physics undergraduate degree, specifically in nuclear physics. And so the combination of aerospace and nuclear was something that I never thought I'd be able to leverage, but there was just the perfect role that needed my background at the German Space Agency, looking at optimizing nuclear technologies for use in space, specifically like how to get heavy cargo to the moon quickly, or how to get humans to Mars as quickly as possible. So I managed to join a project there as really the lead architect for the system, looking at how to use nuclear fission systems combined with electric propulsion to do deep space exploration. From there, I went back into launch vehicles, and we'll probably get into it because it really was the first seeds to founding Atomos and why I was inspired to start the company. But I went into launch vehicles looking at, from a bottoms-up assessment, like what makes sense for a launch industry to support our projections for satellite operators' needs, and what are the shortcomings today? Like, we had the question put to us, if we had a clean slate, how would we design a launch vehicle or a launch infrastructure? And, spoiler alert, it's not how we're doing it at all. So I was also fortunate after several years in Germany to actually be awarded a green card to move to the US. So I took up that opportunity with only 12 hours left on my entry visa, moved to the US, not having been here before, except a short stopover in Hawaii about 20 years ago now, and landed at Lockheed working on space systems for the US Air Force, NOAA, and NASA. But that was really something that was more to get to know the industry here in the US. I recall telling the hiring manager at Lockheed, as I was interviewing for the role there, saying after a couple of years, I'm probably going to leave because I've identified a big problem and I want to create a startup to solve it. So I took the opportunity to learn as much as I could while at Lockheed, work with some great customers and great engineers, and really learn the supply chain before leaving to start Atomos in 2018. So we can talk a little more about Atomos, but the shift from physicist to aerospace engineer to program manager at Lockheed to entrepreneur has been something that I didn't plan for, but I just took every opportunity that came my way.
Fantastic. So you've had quite a zigzag career over the years to get to launching your startup in 2018. But I'd like to know, what was the initial spark that attracted you to the space industry? Was this something that you'd always wanted to be in, or did you have a sudden light bulb moment halfway through your career that this is what I want to do?
Yeah, so it's a little bit embarrassing, but let me tell you the actual genesis, why I really started looking into the space industry. So I had a really phenomenal high school physics teacher who would go off curriculum. And one lesson, he decided to read transcripts from the Apollo missions. So he would read the transcripts between mission control and the astronauts. And there was one mission, I think it was Apollo 9. They were on a trans-lunar injection trajectory. And he's reading the transcript, and one of the astronauts looks out the window and sees something astonishing. And so the transcript is like, oh, gosh, golly, come look at this, guys. Calling over his fellow astronauts, and they're all crowded around the window looking out. And so my teacher pauses in his reading and he's like, guess what they were looking at? So we're like, Apollo 9. Did they see like sunrise from space? Did they see Earthrise from behind the moon? Like, did they go into eclipse and they could see the Milky Way? Like, we're guessing all these really amazing sights that we thought we'd be able to see as astronauts. Anyway, he keeps reading, and it becomes apparent that what the astronauts are watching is a urine dump. So Apollo days, they'd eject urine out and any human waste outside of the spacecraft rather than carry it with them. And so once this urine hit vacuum, it essentially froze solid and was this kind of gleaming shard of, I guess, gold ice. And then as it floated by the window, it hit something on the outside of their spaceship and slow motion exploded like this giant golden disco ball and caught the sunlight. And so I remember thinking, I was like 17, I'm like, imagine an industry where the mundane is so exciting. I really want to work in an industry like that and enable more people to see things like those Apollo 9 astronauts did.
That's incredible. That's such an anecdote that will stick with you forever, I think.
It's so ridiculous, though. I wish I could say that, I watched rocket launches as a kid or something. So, yeah, but it definitely kudos to all of the great teachers out there.
Fantastic. So that was your light bulb moment, and that is definitely one to remember. So would you say that it was quite a difficult challenge, or was it difficult to get into the space industry, or did you sort of set your sights on this and you were, you were pretty dead certain on this is what you wanted to do, or did you face any hurdles along the way?
Yeah, so there are always hurdles, right? So initially, there's the hurdle that in my home country at the time, there was really no domestic space industry. And so I initially chose not to pursue it. But then when I entered the workforce as a physicist, I realized that we had a lot of really great universities who taught great courses in space and aerospace, mostly because they were expats who were Australians who wanted to work in space. They worked abroad and then came back to Australia. So even while there was no industry, I found I could study it. So I took the leap, decided to study a course that would ultimately lead me to leave the country. And then, the next barrier is working in Germany. So my first role at Astron was very international. I spoke English. My second role, I had to speak German. And so at the time, I'd only been in Germany for 2 years, and my German was definitely subpar. And I would work in German for 8 hours a day and then get home and just fall straight asleep because I was so exhausted doing engineering in German. And, there was definitely like a 6 month period where I was always playing catch up. And I was, in the margin of my notebook, I'd be writing down like every new German word I heard and like pretending I knew what everyone was talking about and then going and looking up my dictionary. But I think the biggest challenge that I had was getting a foot in the door. And so this is one of the reasons why I really like organizations like SSPI-WISE. Like I landed my first positions because of networking. I and my third position and really every role I have ever had was because of networking, because I was looking for a position and I was able to use my contacts. And so there was one time where I was between roles and I applied to 70 positions as like a highly qualified aerospace engineer with multiple years experience, 70 positions before I even had an interview request. So, networking perseverance is really, what helped me get over, that the hump to get into the industry. And then certainly being in the industry hasn't been without its challenges that we can dive into a little bit more. But ultimately, like the thing that I want to shine through as the takeaway message is you have to love a challenge. Like this industry is difficult to get into, it's difficult to work in a lot of times because of the incumbents or bureaucracy or the mindset that people want to continue doing things the way they've always been done. And so if you like a challenge, it's a great place to be. If I think that's the mindset that you have to move into any male-dominated industry.
Yeah, and I guess that leads me to my next question, which is, do you think it is because you're a woman that you found it more difficult than maybe necessarily a man wouldn't have?
Yeah, so I think that there are a few areas where like you really have to acknowledge that, you're at a disadvantage, but you're not able to change the system from the bottom. You have to work your way up and then help up the people behind you. So you always have to treat it with good humor. And even if you know that there are disparities in opportunity and things like that, you don't want to draw attention to it or use it as justification for not being able to move forward. Like I think it's um, really the same with any industry or most problems. Like it's very difficult to solve it from the bottom. Like you have to work your way up to the top and then help up those behind you. So, a couple of the distinct things that I recall struggling with is first, early on in my career, I struggled to build credibility. I found that, I do analysis and present it to either my department or my project group or my program manager who may be from a different space agency. I found that my results really weren't taken as seriously as those of male colleagues. So had to work hard and just to understand. Then in a lot of cases, I would have to do more work or find allies to present with me to really get the acknowledgement or the results taken seriously. So that's one thing that is, I think still true. And in my organization, at least, I try to identify and amplify female voices, particularly when they're in the minority, because I think it's very easy to forget that, we all have, um, subconscious biases, even women against women. And so you have to remind yourselves of that and help others up behind you if they don't have the allies to, elevate their results and to build their own credibility. So that's one area. The other area that is a lot more difficult is, I think, a thing that is becoming more prominent, and that's in the venture capital industry. So obviously at Atomos Space, we're a startup. We went and raised 3 rounds of venture capital funding. Now, there's a really an interesting power dynamic when you're a founder raising venture capital. So these venture capitalists they raise their own funds and they're distributing money to founders. And so they take hundreds of founder meetings, thousands of founder meetings every year where founders are asking them for money. And they have the role to pick which companies to invest in. And so this isn't, internal company HR where, you can actually do an assessment and look at, gender inequality and discrimination. Like these are two different organizations interacting with the venture investors, really holding all the cards and having the power. If you look at the statistics, investment in women-led companies, even women co-founded companies, if there's a male co-founder, is substantially below that of male co-founders. I think something like, and it's also decreasing. A couple of years ago, like 3% of venture-backed companies who made it to a Series A stage were founded by women. It's gotten like halved. It's now like 1.5%. And this isn't because women don't make great leaders. This is because a lot of these venture investors are men and they like investing in people who they resonate with, who they build rapport with, and who they also believe are credible. And just because of their own mental model of the world, like people who they really trust to build amazing companies, it's probably going to be someone who looks like them. But then on the flip side of that, there's also women investors who are new and breaking into the industry who also don't want to invest in too many female founders because then they would be seen as the woman who invests in women, not the woman investor who invests in great companies. So there's also subconscious bias in women helping women in terms of venture investors investing in female founders. So that's something that we encountered a lot. So if we looked at our metrics versus competitors' metrics, we had the same or more revenue, we had better technology, and we're further along, a bigger team, more qualified team. And the amounts of money that we're able to raise in our valuation was always substantially lower, like, 2 to 3 times lower. This is something that I don't know how to fix. And it's one thing I want to dedicate the rest of my career towards fixing, because I think that a lot of great companies are just not being funded because of the gender of their CEO.
Yeah, it's a catch-22 essentially, isn't it? Because I mean, that's the importance of mentors and allies, I think. And you mentioned that before, how important it is to have allies along the way. Who are your biggest supporters along the way? And especially during this acquisition, I know you said you faced challenges with the VCs. Who were your biggest supporters?
Yeah, so I think there are really three types of supporters. So one is your peers. And so one thing that um, I didn't do early in my career, I only really did when I moved to the US, was become great friends with other women aerospace engineers and then other women founders in the space industry. And they are, my support group. They're also really great at introductions, helping strategize the business, and also just giving me the feeling that I'm not in this alone. Some of them have even given me really great mental frameworks. So I have a friend who's a CEO of an aerospace company, and she'll talk about something that she did, and she's like, I put, decide to put on the lens of what would I do if I was a man? Particularly in like critical negotiations and things like that, where you have to be more aggressive or you have to walk the line between presenting your company in the best light and overselling, where I think men tend to be a little more on the overselling side. So if you have to go into a situation where you have to kind of move more into what's typically seen as kind of a male persona, she would put essentially like before going into the meeting, kind of think, okay, what would I do if I were a man from Stanford who had tier one investors on my cap table and already was a very credible person in these people's eyes? How would I act? How would I negotiate? And that's something that I also do. These are kind of tips and tricks that you get from your peers. Then, second kind of cohort of supporters are obviously those who are later in their careers. And one thing that I really regret is I was not able to network and find women who are, able to coach me. But I have some great uh, men who took on that role. They saw potential in me and have been helping me out for several years. This is from coaching me in terms of how to present my business and company, and the company, and then also you know, everything from fundraising and connections. So it's, you know, your mentor can be a man, it doesn't have to be a woman. Particularly like if but they have to treat you the way that they would have treated their younger self, not the way in some cases they would have treated their daughter, where it's a little too, white glove. Then the last kind of cohorts of supporters that you need are really people who challenge you and push you further. This can be your customers or your investors, like people who, you know, um, really like to spar with you, challenge you to be better, like question your underlying assumptions and the direction that you're going. It's healthy to have people in your life who do that. For me, that person is my husband. He is phenomenally intelligent. We have a really, really great relationship. He was also co-founder of Atomos. And so we've been working together for a long time, but I am very much an optimist. And he recognized that. And he would come in and be like, hey, yes, I like your outlook, but what overly optimistic assumptions are going into that? So you have to have a supporter on your side who you're okay with making you uncomfortable and asking those hard questions.
Yeah, so you already brought up your husband, which is exactly what I wanted to ask you next, which is what is it like working with your husband? I believe you met and you fell in love after you launched your startup, which is an amazing love story in itself. What was the timeline? Did you meet and then a few years down the line, or was it instantly a professional to, a love story?
So we were introduced in 2017 when I was looking for a co-founder who had a business and finance background. And we took the company full time in early 2018. And then after probably 9 months of working together, we were on a business trip together and I sat down, I'm like, what's going on here? Like, maybe we could ignore this because we're, running a company together and trying to fundraise. So that was one option. The other option was we've been working together like 80 hours a week for 9 months. We know everything there is to know about the other person. Like, let's just see if this works. And so we went with option two. And now we've been happily married for 6.5 years. We have two kids. But, in the fires of creating a startup together, like, really pick your co-founders carefully because, they're people who you will work with intimately. And in the case of my husband, I think I picked very well. Then to the first part of your question, what is it like working with your husband? So it's difficult because the working day never stops. Like I will, we'd be sitting at dinner and I'd want to have a conversation about our kids' day. And then he'll bring up some fire or emergency with the company. And I'm someone who is very good at turning off and he is constantly on and constantly thinking about the company. So he would have to talk through it in that instant. So as long as you kind of understand the other person's kind of philosophy with respect to work-life balance and understand that they can't always turn off and consciously work to give them space and have time together as a couple and not just as a uh, business partner, then it worked really well. There's already like really good communication. There's always really deep trust. We already deeply understand the other person's competencies and shortcomings and we can backfill. So having a deep relationship like that with your co-founder is something that I would really recommend. But, it's not always going to be clear skies. Like if there is something that you disagree with, you have to be able to separate the business disagreement from who you are as people and your personal relationship. But if you
Yeah.
can do that, it's great. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was going to ask in terms of the challenges working with someone who is also your life partner. Um, Professionally, you may have disagreements. He may see the business going in a different way to you. How have you resolved that in the past in terms of what you both want for the business?
Yeah. So there's like three steps. First is like understanding and predicting what their perspective is going to be. So I remember early in the company, we were doing a workshop where the organizer of the workshop would say, hey, where is everyone here? on the spectrum of optimist to pessimist or perfectionist to, first draft is good enough. And for every single one of these kind of working profiles, my husband and I were on different sides of the room, like polar opposites. We're always very, very opposite in how we do things and how we approach things and how we think about things. So first is understanding that, like knowing what their perspective is, how they're going to address a problem. Second is essentially putting it in the frame of the long-term vision of the company. So why you're doing things and then the core of how you're going to do it. And so, making sure you understand and with respect to a certain decision, in that frame, why you've come to the conclusion that you have. And then third part is just having an open dialogue about it, understanding their perspective, and then essentially trading the pros and cons. And if you do have a disagreement that you really won't be able to reach amends on, uh, having a framework as to who has authority in what situation. So, for example, for marketing, product, sales, technology, hiring, like I always had authority. But if it came to corporate governance, um, defense contracts and sales, budgeting and spending, William had authority. So if we had a disagreement and it was something that he was the owner for, his decision would be the one we would go with. And I would have to disagree but commit and fully lean into what we committed to. But then vice versa, if I wanted to do something in one of my areas that I really owned, then he would also disagree and commit. So, having good clarity around how and why you make decisions also really helps.
Well, your partnership seems to have worked because of this amazing news this week. I'm going to repeat that. Well, your partnership seems to have worked because you've got an incredible business that you've set up. I'd like to talk a bit about your startup. Could you tell us what was the problem that you set out with launching this startup? What problem were you trying to solve?
So I want to talk about the two seeds that were really planted that caused us to found Atomos. So first was working at the German Space Agency. I helped conceive and was brought onto a task force to provide recommendations to German Space Agency, European Space Agency, and then the European space primes as to how to address the growing threat of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket. So at the time, so this is a little over 10 years ago, the Falcon 9 had now been launched successfully a few times, and its price point was substantially below the European workhorse rocket at the time, the Ariane 5. So I worked in launch vehicle conceptual design. I was like, I have some ideas for how we can not just meet the Falcon 9's cost and performance, but also greatly exceed it. And so I worked with a team proposing kind of novel ideas. These are things that actually now look a lot like SpaceX's Starship. So like, let's use the same engine on the first stage and second stage, multiples of those engines. Like, let's look at in-space refueling technology. Let's look at in-space transportation segments. So break up launch and then orbit race through insertion orbit, and essentially have a permanent piece of infrastructure in space able to do that orbit race. Or let's look at different propellants. So me and my group at the German Space Agency were presenting these ideas. We weren't really getting anywhere. We had some really high up allies, but ultimately the decision to build the Ariane 6 rocket wasn't made by engineers. It also wasn't made by people looking at the unit economics or the market. The decision was really made based on politics because in Europe, you have the geo-return policy with the European Space Agency. So they needed 40% of the work to go to Germany. And Germany had the Vinci engine and the, cryogenic upper stage that had to be built. 40% had to go to France. France has the core stage and the Vulcan 2 rocket engine. And then, we need Italy as well. They need 20%. Okay, we'll give them solid rocket motors. So it is a geopolitical rocket, not something that has been designed to be commercially competitive. And I was there tearing my hair out, being like, we're missing such a big opportunity, and we're excluding so many new players from coming to the market because we're not sitting down and trying to, we're solving the wrong problem. We're solving the problem of geo-return to ESA states. We're not solving the problem of what is the best rocket to be building for Europe right now. So that was, what really prompted me to move to the US. And then while I was at Lockheed, I worked on a few programs where I saw the cost and design cycle of putting your propulsion system on board a spacecraft. Often we would have to pick the launch vehicle 10 years before we launched, and based on that choice, design the propulsion system, which would cost tens of millions of dollars. And if that propulsion system failed, and there is one case publicly where you can see it did fail that I actually worked on with the MUOS-5 satellite, like we're going to lose a $500 million satellite. So, from my experiences looking at the launch industry and how launch vehicles were designed at the time, looking at in-space propulsion and how these single point failure systems could really cause an entire mission to be lost, I co-founded Atomos together with William to change that paradigm completely. So we were building orbital transfer vehicles, so systems that could perform orbit raise maneuvers for spacecraft, but then also recover them if they had an onboard propulsion issue. So our typical mission that we're designing to is our Quark orbital transfer vehicle would be waiting in space. The client spacecraft might need a relocation or adjustment for a new mission. We would go rendezvous with it, attach to it, and move it to its new location. And so that's provided orbit raise deployment, that's provided access to deep space from low Earth orbit, and there's also provided life extension and midlife um, mission reassignment to spacecraft that are already in space. So, it's a very powerful mission. And it's something that we're still building towards at Catalyst Space, but now with the added mission of repairing and upgrading those satellites and also making space more secure with an in-space proliferated space domain awareness network.
And who are some of these customers that you have or competitors for the OTV market? What's it like at the moment?
Yeah, so there's really three core customer segments. So the first is telecommunications operators. So these operators are typically multinational companies that are operating very large spacecraft that cost between 200 million and 500 million to launch with a 15-year lifetime. But given kind of capital markets and then pressures with again, some declining revenue, so no more cable TV since we're all streaming, they want to keep operating those assets without paying $200 million to replace them. So our primary commercial customers actually want us to rendezvous with their spacecraft and bring them back into the center of their operating box, which buys them 4 to 5 years additional lifetime without launching and operating a new satellite. So it's a really great business case for them. They're paying a few million per year for our services as opposed to 500 million to replace the asset, but they still can serve their critical customer base and continue generating revenue. That's kind of core customer base. The next customer base is really on the government side. So you're probably aware, Western governments use space for a lot of things. So Earth observation for weather, climate monitoring, and intelligence and reconnaissance. They also use it for missile tracking and warning systems, GPS. So all of position, navigation, timing systems are currently satellite network based. And then also the last one is communications. So secure communications around the world, military, and then also for commercial applications. Now, these large fleets of government spacecraft, currently are in, say, a period of flux right now. There's a lot going on with geopolitical pressures. There are some bad nation state actors out there who are doing things like interfering with other people's assets. So, our mission with them is to first characterize the environment, see what's going on, and then, if required, move one of their spacecraft to either an area of safety or a new operating domain if there is a new mission that comes online. So just promoting resiliency and security in space. And then the last market segment is one that I'm most excited about, and that's really the emerging market. If you look at some of the recent startups that have been announced doing asteroid mining or space-based solar power or extracting resources from the moon, either for propellant or other applications like fusion, like all of these systems require a very large infrastructure in space. And so our business is to monitor and manage their large-scale fleets or assemble their systems on orbit or transport them to where they need to be. Because ultimately, like we want a future where we can have businesses like space-based solar power or
data centers in space or move a lot of industry off world so it can be in space just for more sustainability on Earth. Ultimately, I think that is the mission of many space companies and what we all want to accomplish. And yeah, again, that's the future that we're building towards, well, initially at Atomos, but now at Catalyst.
Yeah, so that's what I was going to ask in terms of what next for you and in terms of this merger with Catalyst. Where do you see your company going and what are you hoping to achieve? I know you kind of just answered that a little bit, but where do you see it going in the next 5 years?
So at Catalyst, we really see that we're at kind of the cusp of entering a new era of space operations. That's where a lot of operators have in their baseline plan the assumption that their spacecraft is going to be docked with and either upgraded, repaired, refueled, or maneuvered to a new location. So if you thought, so we started space with government satellites and then moved into commercial telecommunications, and then we saw the proliferation of smaller platforms. It's kind of our theory that small platforms are really reaching their ceiling in terms of capacity. So we want to allow more ambitious missions in space with larger platforms in space, but achieved in a very sustainable way. So that's where we want to be in 5 years' time. We want to be modifying, repairing, upgrading, and assembling large structures in space. But in terms of immediate goals, we have 3 flight missions going up next year. So we're delivering payloads to Space Force here in the US. We have a commercial demonstrator, and then we have another Space Force and US defense industry demonstrator later in the year. And then we're launching in early 2027 our commercial system. So the Quark vehicle that we're developing in Atomos that will go and relocate and rescue spacecraft for commercial telecommunications operators to allow them to better manage their fleets and really demonstrate this amazing capability of being able to rendezvous and manipulate assets in space.
Wow, so a very busy next couple of years for you to dive straight in to your new role. Um, just as we wrap up now, I wanted to ask you, what advice would you give to anyone wanting to break out into the space industry and sort of follow you? Because you're incredibly inspirational. You've had this amazing career path, and someone wanting to do essentially what you're doing. What advice would you give to them?
Yeah, so there are 3 things. So I think I already covered 2 of them. But first is network. Like it is a competitive industry to get into, particularly for the types of roles you're probably interested in. So go to whatever networking events that you can, join industry groups, like put your name out there. You may not get job offers coming in, but you'll have a great network who can help, recommend you to certain companies or the hiring manager. So first step is network. Second thing that I'd really recommend, and this particularly at university or early career level, is actually build hardware. This is something that I always struggled to break into because I would go join a rocketry team or a Formula SAE team, and it would be all guys. And I'd be like, is there any work I can do? And I'd get kind of a little bit of work, that wouldn't give me any assembly or testing. It'd normally be analysis. And I should have been more forceful. And I'm like, you know what? I actually want to, help put the frame together or the drivetrain together or go out and test some things. Because I think ultimately, like a lot of women early in their careers don't actually touch hardware as engineers. So I definitely recommend finding a way to do that. And then last piece of advice that I have is something I said before, and it's you have to know that this is going to be challenging and difficult, but you have to love a challenge. So embrace the challenge, and then at the end of it, love proving people wrong. So, that's they're the 3 things I'd keep in mind.
I love that. I love that. And then one final question, which is quite similar, but a little bit specific. It's a bit of a fun one. If you could put one message in a capsule and send it to the next generation of women, what would it say? Something very, very small, very short, but a very strong message which you think you'd want them to know.
In terms of a time capsule, I don't know. This is a message that I would tell my daughter today and want to make sure that any woman out there knows, and that's that your idea is as valid as everyone else's. Just make sure that it's heard.
I love that. Thank you so much, Vanessa. That's a great message. And thank you so much for speaking to us. It's been an amazing conversation with you, and I'm excited to see where your career goes next and all the things that are coming your way with Catalyst. So yeah, thank you for joining us. And we'd love to have you back on again in the future.
All right. Thank you for taking the time. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.